It's so tempting to cast on a new knitting project when you're bored with your current project, you're stuck on sleeve island or second sock syndrome, or you're working on something more difficult and you keep making mistakes and you're frustrated of all the frogging and fixing. You just want something mindless to knit. There are so many reasons we end up casting on another project, but after a while, I don't know about you, but I start to get a little stressed out by that pile of projects. That's why I like to have some knitting rules in place. Now, these aren't hard and fast rules, and I break them all the time as well, but I know that if I sort of stick to these rules, then my knitting is going to be more stress-free than it will be if I see a pile of unfinished projects that I need to work through. After all, knitting is supposed to be something that we enjoy, not another chore that has to be crossed off our to-do list. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting's a form of self-care, that you can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies like knitting, but still create beautiful garments that you love to wear. And I really want to sort of dive deep into that self-care side of things. I feel like having some knitting rules can be more part of that self-care side, at least for me, and I'm sure some of you out there as well. Now, if you're the type who can cast on a new project every day and have piles and piles of works in progress and things that have to get finished, and it doesn't bother you or stress you out or overwhelm you, then good for you. But the rest of us, if you start to feel a little bit of stress because you can see that pile of unfinished things that need to be, ends woven in or buttons attached or seaming done, or you've just cast on so many projects and there's so many works in progress that you can't even decide which one to do next because there's so much that needs to be done. That overwhelm and that stress. Now, that's not what we want in our knitting, obviously. We want our knitting to be relaxing. I am tangled up over here. Give me a second to untangle my yarn. So we want to be relaxed when we're knitting. So I think sometimes some rules, if you want to call them rules, or guidelines, are probably a good idea, so you're not being stressed or overwhelmed. So I want to share my sort of rules or guidelines. I break them all the time as well, but they're nice to have in place so I can't fall into that place of overwhelm and stress when it comes to knitting. Now, things are a little bit different for me because I do YouTube videos, I design and I teach, so I have lots of different things I have to work on. So I do apply these rules for my personal knitting, but they might end up getting a little broken because of the other things I have to work on when it comes to designing or teaching or creating videos. But I like to have them in place just to limit myself a little bit so I'm not feeling that overwhelm and stress. And I asked about your knitting rules as well. So we're gonna share some of your comments and talk. That way it's sort of more of a two-way conversation. It's not just me talking at the camera, even though it really is. At least I have your comments to share as well and your insight. And there were a lot of really insightful comments, and I have quite a few I wanted to share. And of course, I can't share every single one because we'd be here a lot longer than you probably want to sit for an episode of Knit and Chat. So I will link to that conversation or that question down below this video, and you can click over and see what other comments or rules that other knitters have as well. So along with that community post, there was a poll, because not everybody's going to leave a comment about their rules, but they might just quickly answer a poll. So with the results here, as you can see, the majority of people don't have any rules when it comes to their knitting, but there's quite a few that actually do. So I thought it was worth discussing all those knitting rules. So I'm going to go through my rules and talk about your rules and comments as well within there. So the first rule I have is a limit on the number of projects I can have going on at once. Now, this applies to my personal projects because, I can't really apply that to things for teaching or designing because, there's deadlines and things I have to work on. I try to just focus on one design at a time, though, just to make things easier. Unless I'm at a stage where it's just like finishing and just easy knitting, they don't really have to think, then I can start the next design project. But in general, those are sort of separate. But for my personal projects, I have 10 project bags. And some of those are for designs or class things too. So I have a limit right there where I can't have more than 10 things because I like to have each project in its own bag so I can just grab and go. I can go sit wherever I want or take it with me or go sit out in my backyard. And obviously if I didn't have projects in their own bags, I have to like grab the yarn and the needles and I'm hauling that around without having it protected in a bag, which I just don't want to do. I like having each of the projects in their own container. Now, I mean, of course I could go buy more bags, and who knows, if I see a cute bag, I might buy another one. If I run out of bags, then I can't obviously start a new project until I empty a bag. So that sort of is an easy way to limit the amount of projects I have. And of course that will probably change with the more bags I get, but I think at that point I could divide them up and have so many that are just for personal projects, and then the rest I can use for like teaching or design stuff. And then they could be separated that way, and that could still sort of be a limit on the number of bags I have. So that's sort of like, I don't count my projects and then say, oh, I want to cast on something else. I just see, oh, I've got an empty bag here. I could start something new because I've got an empty bag. So that works well for me at this point. As I accumulate more bags, that might have to change in the future. So I'm not the only one who has this kind of limit. Linnell does as well. She says, more like I run out of project bags in the correct size and length of needles. So if I don't purchase any more project bags and needle cords, then I am good. So yeah, we limit ourselves by the space we have for our projects. And that's a good way to do it, I think. Now, I also sort of limit the project's types, not really limit them, but like I'll have generally a sweater or a cardigan, something I can wear either for myself or if I'm knitting for somebody else. And then I'll probably have a shawl on the needles, and I might have a pair of socks, especially if I'm doing a sock tutorial. So that falls under the teaching thing, but generally I'm not going to have another pair of socks. I'll finish that pair first, and then it's a reward to start the next pair. And then I might have other small accessories, but it's usually a limit of like 1 per type, depending on what I'm working on, basically. I mean, it can vary from like season to season and what I actually want to knit. And I wanted to highlight a few more comments here. I haven't had rules until this point, but I'm thinking I need to limit projects so that our living space isn't littered with works in progress. So I'm thinking 1 big project, like a blanket or sweater, a shawl, 1 pair of socks, mittens, or a hat, and an embroidery or needlepoint project at a time. So yeah, I like that. That's a good way to sort of limit things based on like the type of project that you're working on. Then Campina 3167, yes, I have a rule. Usually I don't have more than 4 projects at a time because I get overwhelmed and frustrated easily when I have to choose one to work on, or I don't see the progress I would like to see. That's true. Like if you have a lot of projects going on at once, you're probably not going to make as much progress as you would like because you're sort of spreading out that knitting time over all of these projects. Or if something is like languishing and not getting done, it's easy to forget like what you were working on, or like if you were changing anything, if you didn't write down any notes, then yeah, there's other reasons to limit the amount of projects as well. And then Sally says, I never have more than 3 or 4 projects, but it's usually just 2. More causes my anxiety to increase. So yeah, it's nice that we learn to our limits. Like I can have quite a few, but I have that divided into like personal things, which I probably only have maybe 4 or 5 personal projects, and then like a few design or teaching things as well. But it's nice when you can sort of figure out what that number is for you, where you're okay to knit, but then anything above that and the stress or anxiety start creeping in. And Skypaw says the same, no more than 3 at a time. If we include crochet, it's no more than 4 at a time. I get overwhelmed super easily and I'm much more of a project knitter than a process knitter. So this has worked really well for me. And then Maze Ruth, I've been forcing myself to have no more than 2 yarn projects going at a time. I am very susceptible to squirrel brain, and it's too easy for me to get 50 million things going at once. Then it gets overwhelming and nothing gets done. It's very hard for me to stick to it. I just remind myself in a very stern manner that I know the consequences of my actions if I don't. Yes, I love that talking to yourself in a stern manner. That's really good. I can almost picture that. And then Moon Basket, I try to have 1 easy project and 1 harder project. That way I can have something to work on without much thought, and when I'm having a bad health day, but I don't get bored on good days because I have the harder project too. I tried to have more than 2 at once, but I got overwhelmed. Knitting isn't my only crafty hobby, so I try to keep it contained. Now that's a good way too. Like if you want to limit it, then have like a sort of mindless project, but then something that's more technical so you can swap between the two. I really like that. Now, another thing that can affect like how many projects you can have besides your project bags is also your knitting needles, especially if you have like a limited number. Even if you have an interchangeable set, you only have so many tips. And I've started to purchase extra tips in the sizes that I use the most because I get tired of taking them off one project and moving them to another. But I can see how having a limit on your needles and the cords would also be like an easy way to limit the number of projects. And there were some comments about that too. My rules are simple. When I run out of needles, I have to finish a project. I have more works in progress than I have yarn to finish them. And then Yo-Yo Creative, my rules, 1 of each project, 1 big, 1 small, can also be broadened into 1 sock, 1 hat, 1 sweater, and so on, and not buying more needles than I already have. I have pretty much all the sizes in straight and circular needles, so if my 3mm needles are in use, I'll have to finish or frog the project that it's used for before I use them for a new project. At the moment, I have 2 works in progress, a sweater and the second sock of a pair, and I'll move between those 2. And then Arena says, I like to have a few projects at the same time. Now I am at 4, and that's a good number. I don't think I really have rules. The one I have would be if you have needles of the right size on a project, you can't begin a project with the same size needle. I don't buy several needles of the same type. I wait until I don't need them anymore. And then one more comment, only 1 rule, thou shalt not buy knitting needles to start yet another project unless you don't have the right size. Yeah, so that is really... I like that you don't have to like literally count your projects and then figure out, okay, that's my limit. You're just using your needles or your number of project bags to sort of self-limit. Like you can't start anything else if there's no bag free or if you don't have the right needles for that. So along with this, I sort of break it down as well into different categories. So I sort of have these all written as separate things, but rule two would be only 1 sweater at a time, or a cardigan, 1 garment, like 1 full garment at a time, which I'm breaking right now actually because I'm knitting a personal one, but I'm also working on one for a class. So they're sort of separate because my personal knitting is usually like Friday and then the weekends, and that's my personal knitting time, or in the evenings if I don't have any like deadline schedules for teaching or designing. So I do break those rules occasionally, but I would say like a big garment, I try to do just 1. I'm not having multiple garments going on at once. I suppose I might adjust that depending, like I try to choose things, at least for myself, where I like it's an interesting construction or I just really want the finished thing. So they're usually not super simple patterns most of the time, but I would say if I were going to knit like just some super basic stockinette, nothing else going on, especially if I got like some really lovely, I don't know, cashmere yarn and I just wanted some basic classic style, I might cast that one on like as an extra one if I have the needles and a project bag, because to me a garment like that would be super simple for knitting wise. It would be one of those mindless knitting projects. Once I got past the swatching and measurements and making sure I've got the right size or any modifications I want to make, because I can never just knit a sweater straight. I always modify it, but that is just a part of knitting a sweater that's going to fit, is making modifications to fit your body. But that is probably my first rule, is basically 1 garment at a time. So I'm not getting... because I feel like those types of big projects, that would be easily overwhelming if you've got lots of sweaters or cardigans going on at the same time. I mean, I'm not talking like a baby sweater that you can finish in like a couple evenings at the most, but like a full adult-sized garment, then yeah, I like to limit that to just 1 if possible. But I mean, I break that rule all the time because especially if I'm teaching or designing, then I might have multiple things on the go at once. One more thing I like with that, just having 1 on the go, like personal sweater at a time, is when I start to get sort of bored with it, especially when you're closing it on the end, you've got the sleeves and things are just kind of meh, that's when I like to start thinking about the next sweater. I can, you know, start looking at patterns I have saved and maybe buy the yarn if I don't have it already, and I can do my swatching for that sweater while I'm still working on the previous one. So by the time I finish the one I have, then I'm ready to like cast on and start the next one because I've done all of that pre-planning ahead of time. I also have this same rule as it applies to shawls. Now, shawls for me are sort of like my candy knitting. Like, I like to wear them. I generally choose ones that have a really long wingspan so I can wrap them around me like a scarf, or, you know, just around my shoulders when I'm chilly. I don't really do the whole like bib style, like triangle shawls where it's all kind of hanging in the front. I don't need extra fabric right here, but I love them to wear them like a scarf, or, you know, with my winter coat, or I've got one right here on my chair, not this one behind me, but the one that you can't see on the other side of the camera. When it's chilly in the morning and I'm at my desk, I can wrap it around my shoulders or my neck. And I'm thinking I need to keep one by my bed as well. And because when I sit up and read at night, and if it's chilly, you know, I can wrap my shoulders around that. Maybe I'll just go old school Miss Marple and knit myself a little bed jacket. But shawls work for that. But for me, I don't swatch for shawls. I assume I'm going to be pretty close, and if it's off a little bit, I really don't care in the long run. But I have to limit myself because there are so many lovely shawl patterns that I could spend all my time knitting. So I have that's a hard rule, unless it's one personal that's somebody else's design, and then one that if I'm designing myself, then I could have multiple in that case. But for the most part, when it comes to personal knitting, it's one shawl at a time, because that's sort of, I like to pick shawls that might either have like a unique construction or a really fun stitch pattern, or maybe I just want the finished shawl, like I just really love it and I want it. Any of those reasons, but I can only knit one at a time from somebody else's designs, and there's so many lovely designs out there. I've got a mile-long list of shawls that I'd love to have. And sort of the same thing as well as the sweater, like if I'm starting to get bored with it, it's motivation. I will start looking at other shawls and which one do I want to knit next. And I mean, I might have the yarn for it already. If it's one of like when I order at the end of one year, then I've got a whole bunch for the next year. Or I might just, you know, splurge and buy some new yarn for a new shawl that I hadn't seen before. And that sort of motivation to finish the current one. But I'm a little bit bogged down right now. I'm working on the Festival of Stitches, which is a great shawl. I'm not saying it's a bad pattern. It's a great, great pattern. It's just I'm on the cable section, and I really don't like cables on sock weight, fingering weight yarn. They're so tiny. So I'm just powering through those cables so I can get to the next fun stitch pattern. But that's a me problem, not a pattern problem. It's just I like cables with other yarn weights, but I don't love them with sock and fingering weight yarn, because you lose a stitch, and I feel like it's so hard to find and pick up and fix on the needles, you know, like that, just that fine yarn like that. But so this is, I'm at that point, so I'm trying to power through, but now I have I've got some yarn for a few other shawls. So right now I could be like picking out what's the next one I want to work on, and that'll be my motivation to finish the one I'm currently working on so I can cast on whatever the next one is. And I've got a few that I want to knit, so this will help me like process and finish the one I'm working on now so I can get to that next one. But the pattern is great. I really do recommend it, especially if you want sort of a different construction and you like lots of color and stitch patterns all combined. This is a really great pattern. So I'll have a link for that pattern down below too. And that also applies to sort of the next garment type would be socks. I can only have one pair of socks going at a time. I cannot have multiple pairs of socks. Unless I were doing a personal one and then I had to do one for like a design or something, then that I might have a little overlap there. But as far as personal knitting, one pair of socks at a time. And I have to finish them, including weaving in the ends, before I can start the next pair. That's another one where I don't really swatch, because I know like the stitch count I usually need for the size I wear. And that would be easy enough to just start. But same as the shawls, like if I'm getting bored with that second sock, I can start looking at the next sock pattern and motivate myself to get finished with the current one. Isn't it weird? Like we get so excited about a project, but then we start to get like towards the end and it's just like the slog point comes and you don't want to finish it and you don't want to work on it. And it's not just me that gets that way, right? And you need the next project in your queue to feel motivated to finish the current one. And then you just repeat the cycle with that next pattern. It's a vicious cycle, I tell ya. So I'm not the only one who has a limit on the project types as well. I didn't have rules, but now I have to have rules as my works in progress take up too much space now that I can't knit a lot. So I need to finish one type of project before I can start another, unless they are gift knits. So a cowl must be finished before I can start another cowl. I need to finish a jumper before starting a jumper, and I'm only allowed to buy yarn if it helps me finish a project. Once my stash is done, I want to only buy yarn for specific projects. But that's how I started, and I somehow acquired too much yarn. I feel like talking about yarn stash could be a whole separate thing about having rules around that. I'm not sure I'm the right person to discuss it because I don't really have a stash. All of the yarn behind me is for specific projects or for teaching or designs. And even I've got some hanging up over here. Those are sort of leftovers from projects, full skeins. So I'll either use them for another design or a personal project, so they're not like earmarked for anything in particular. And then I've got like some bins behind me on the floor or on the bottom shelf that have leftovers. That's where I've got all my yarn, like all my stash is leftovers from other projects. But I'm just not the type to buy yarn to buy it because it's pretty or whatever. I usually have a project in mind. The only time I would break that is if I'm like on a vacation and I want to go visit a yarn shop. I might buy like a skein of sock yarn or maybe enough for a shawl, something to sort of remember that trip by, even if I don't have a pattern picked out for that particular yarn. That would be like probably the only instance. I don't just like shop for yarn and buy it on a whim. I usually have a project in mind. So everything right behind me, all of that is for specific projects, and it's right there until I'm ready to cast on that project. But all my project bags are full, so I can't cast it on right now, so it waits right there. Now, sort of another rule I have or guideline is I can have one project that has sort of like maybe a new skill or a technique that I want to practice. And there's some overlap with this as well, but I really don't want to have all of my projects to be like super focused on skills and techniques, and every time I sit down I've got to watch a YouTube video or learn how to do something. But I like to have one project at least that has something like that built into it so I can improve my skills. And yes, I know I'm a master knitter and all that blah blah blah, but that doesn't mean I know everything about knitting. I'm working on a double knit scarf right now. I had to do one swatch, I think, in the master's program, and I passed, thank goodness, but that doesn't mean I'm fabulous at double knitting. So I wanted to use this scarf as a way to practice. I am super slow and my edges are terrible. Those edge stitches, I've got to work on some techniques for that. But it's a good way to practice that technique. And I'd like to learn like the what is it called? Lever knitting, where you've got like the straight needle under your arm. I'd like to learn like that knitting style. Like there's just different things, but I don't want to have like every project like that. So I try to limit that to just maybe one, usually one, maybe a second one once I start to get the rhythm on that first pattern. And this overlaps, of course, with like the project types. Like it could be on a sock, on a sweater, or whatever I'm doing to practice that technique. But I do like to have something like that in there because there are so many skills and techniques. I feel like the more I learn about knitting, the more I realize I don't know. I know, but yeah, there's just so much to explore. And part of the process of knitting for me is exploring all of those techniques. And just, I really am fascinated about that part of knitting. So I could talk about that for a while, but we will just move on from that. But yes, there's so many techniques to explore and project types and just so much we could say about that. But let's move on and read some of your comments here. So Patricia, I stopped knitting and not finishing everything in sight a couple years ago and now keep only 2 or 3 projects on the go. One of which should be a project that I will learn something new, even if it's only a small thing. I've also dedicated 2024 to knitting from stash, as mine is on the large size and full of beautiful wool. And then Darlene, rule to keep my projects at a manageable level and to develop a new skill from each project. Using a new set of tools, incorporating a new design or texture, developing my knitting reading skills, making a new wearable article. Currently, I'm working on knitting a hat, a learning sock, and a shawl from an Italian designer. So yes, I like that there are some of us out there who are a little bit more nerdy and want to look at these different techniques and try some variety in our knitting. And then Terry says, I only have 3 active projects, 1 complex project where I need absolute focus, no TV, etc., 1 regular project, and 1 knitting group project that's easy to fix. I guess I need to amend to 4. I always carry an emergency sock in the car for waiting for a train or unexpected meeting or the kids, the kind of sock that does not need a pattern at hand. I love that, emergency sock. Right now mine is an emergency hat, just a simple knit 1 purl 1 rib until it's as long as I need it to be, and then I'll just work on the crown. Really simple. But yes, so my emergency hat, I guess I always keep a small project in my purse that's separate from like all my other knitting projects, something that is like this emergency sock that you just have with you all the time for those times when you have to wait and you want something to do besides scroll your phone. And then 1 more, something new I'm learning as I go, something challenging or that has a fixed or counted pattern, something easy, simple, usually stockinette or ribbed in the round that I don't need to think about once it's started for brain fog days, or watching a movie or listening to a class to keep my hands busy. Yes, we all need those kinds of projects. Okay, maybe not everybody, but I like to have a small, simple project for keeping my hands busy. So the next thing I would say would be like rules around finishing. This is another rule, I think, because it's easy to like sort of cast something off, throw it in a pile of things that are done, cast on the very next thing, but you're not quite done. You've got ends to weave in. You maybe got to wash it and maybe block it or do something to it to get it nicely finished. Maybe the button bands or adding some buttons or any of those things. This is where I feel like it's easy to reward yourself. It's finished. I bound off. I can just chuck it in this pile of finished projects and cast on something new. But I do try to have the finishing as part of my rules as well, because it's very easy to like finish a sock and not weave in the ends. I think I actually wear a pair around the house and I never did weave in the end that's like around the toe, and I can feel it a little. It bugs me. I really should go in and weave in the end on that sock. But for me, I try to make the finishing part of that project, and I can't cast on the next thing until it's absolutely finished and it's been washed. But this changes or varies from person to person. Other people might be better at weaving in ends and doing all that finishing better than I am, but especially with a garment, I'm not going to start a new garment beyond swatching, choosing the pattern and all of that until like that sweater or cardigan is finished, the button bands and everything that needs to be done, ends woven in, ready to wash. Then I can cast on the next one, because I have instances where I would just leave it not finished because I didn't want to do the button band and figure out like the pickup rate or whatever. And then what was the point of knitting that project if you're not actually going to finish it completely? But anyway, so there are other ways to manage this as well. Blaze says, not rules exactly, but I try to limit things outside of scrappy blankets. I have a couple of those ongoing, but they're years long projects, to one larger, like a multi-skein shawl or sweater, or a couple of equivalent smaller projects, always 1 pair of vanilla socks and 1 other sock project, usually lace, cable, or texture. I'm also trying this year to clear 1 hibernating work in progress per quarter. So that's a good way to manage things if you are seeing those like they're off the needles but they're not quite finished. Then maybe like making sure you do 1 a month, just getting them cleaned out if that's starting to pile up for you, or once per quarter. And then Nitty Linny, no rules. I like variety, but I feel overwhelmed if I have more than 4 or 5 active works in progress going. I make a list and focus on finishing first the ones that are mostly done, and I don't cast on a new project until I finish 2 works in progress. It's hard, but it works to get me back in my safe zone. Most languishing projects get frogged. So yeah, you have to make decisions about the things that are sort of been hanging out for a while. Are you actually going to finish that thing, or should you just frog it and move on to something else? And for those where this is a struggle, I know Finish It February is a big thing, where you just pull out all of those things that have been languishing and hanging out and need finishing, pull them out in February and make a plan to work on those. We have a few comments about that. So Roxanne Richardson, who has a fabulous YouTube channel, I allow myself to cast on anything, anytime, but I also have a way to address unfinished objects every year by pulling them all out in February to reacquaint myself with anything that got put to the side. I then decide if I'm going to finish them ever, or if I'm finished with them in whatever state they're in. It's completely eliminated any negative feelings I might have about starting new projects when there's already a pile of them, because I know I will address them when Finish It February comes around. That's a really healthy way to look at things. So no rules, but you know, by next year, February, you've got to deal with that pile. And then Antisocial Auntie, everything I start before July 1st needs to be decided on, whether it's going to be finished or frogged, in July. So my last half of the year doesn't have project guilt as I start more things. But the number of projects doesn't matter. So that's another great way to like wrap up all of those things. When you're starting to get too many projects, there are different ways you can sort of make rules for yourself about getting those things either finished or frogged, but doing something with them, making a decision about them at certain points in the year. I like this idea of like everything in July. It's got to be all the stuff you've started in the first half of the year, get it all done. I find I do that at the end of the year. Like I want to start a new year with sort of a clean slate. So I try to finish all of my projects by Christmas, and then Christmas is like new cast on time because I usually, you know, take a few weeks vacation from work and I've got lots of knitting time. So I want to sort of clear the decks for the new year. For me, that seems to naturally happen around Christmas, but I like this idea of July as well. I might think about that. I'm going to see what I've got like for my projects and see if I want to clear the decks in July. That might be a good thing to do twice a year, like in the summer and then in the winter, making sure everything is finished, or finish it February, whatever works for you for getting those works in progress or the UFOs all finished and off the needles or frogged. Those are most of my rules, but there were some more comments that were worth highlighting. So we're just going to read through those and discuss them. Now, first one is Queen Sydney, no rules, but I try to only cast on either projects I really want to do or projects I need to do. Need meaning gifts, weather, etc. That way either enthusiasm or deadlines carry me through to the end. I usually don't have more than 3 going at a time. Actually, finishing something is part of what I enjoy. I think the second half always goes faster than the first half of a project for me. It's a good way to divide things, like things you want for yourself, but other things that you have to like work on, like gifts or things like that. And then the next one, no rules, but I know my limits. I can't have more than 4 projects going at the same time, and I have at least 1 crochet project and 1 knitting project. And then Paula, no rules, but I prefer only 2 at a time, probably part of my personality, but also maybe a reflection of relative inexperience. I don't want to relearn a pattern over and over, which happens if I don't work on it regularly. It's a really good point. If you're a newer knitter, it's probably better to focus on just a few projects, so you're not like totally forgetting what you were doing when you come back to it, which can happen when you start to have piles of projects. And honestly, it still happens to me. If it's a project that's more difficult and I didn't take careful notes, then coming back to it after a long period of time can sort of throw me for a loop, and I've got to sort of relearn what I was working on. And then Experimentally Theoretical says, I try to have only 1 project per area, 1 car project, 1 TV chair project, and 1 mobile in my purse project. I really like that idea, like a project for each place where you like to knit. I like that. That's a really creative way of choosing projects. I think for me, the only issue would be like if I wanted something mindless or something that's more technical, but I guess that would depend on where you're going to be doing that project. I wouldn't be doing something super technical in the car. Maybe when I'm watching TV, but maybe not. I don't know, but I do like this idea of projects for places. It's really cool. PL Lorio 3166 says, my rule is actually not a limit, but a minimum, at least 1 project for me. I can make many projects, but always has to be 1 for me in between so I don't burn myself out on other people. Secondary rule, no more than 4 active projects. I don't have that issue. Most of my projects are for myself, and then there are a few scattered in there for others. But yes, if you're the type who loves to knit and gift, then maybe, yeah, have a project that's just for you in there as well. And then Lori says, I like to have a small, medium, and large project on the needles. When I finish one, I usually replace it with something else. I can't imagine having like 3 sweaters on the needles. I also know now, thanks to tracking my projects, how much I can get realistically done in a year. So it's been helpful to know that, for example, I'm not going to get 12 sweaters done in a year, but I might get 3 done. Of course, I have way more than that in my queue. I find each year does bring a different focus to my projects. For example, this year my focus is to use my own hand spun. I feel each person is different and everyone should do what works for them so that it brings them joy and not stress. That's the most important thing. And I thought that was a great comment to leave things on. So your rules shouldn't be there to bring you any more stress either, but more to limit the stress and sort of limit yourself a little bit so you don't get overwhelmed and stressed. But yeah, rules are meant to be broken. Maybe we shouldn't say that. I don't know. But I'd love to know about your rules, if you agree with any of these, if you disagree with them, or if you have other rules that you apply to your knitting or your other yarny, crafty projects. Leave a comment, share your rules with us, and if you want to keep the conversation going, go down and read those comments and share your thoughts and opinions as well. And perhaps we'll discuss this topic again in the future. And if you want to continue hanging out with me, you'll find a video right here, so click through and I'll see you in the next video.